when the clock strikes the final hour, only those who listen will be prepared. Have you ever imagined what it means to live knowing there are hidden messages, 7 instructions that have been kept hidden and that now, for some reason beyond? Simple explanation. Begin to knock on our door. What do the 7 unrevealed messages of Medjugorje contain, and why is time now of the essence? This is the question that will guide us in the next few minutes. And if you're here, it's because, in some way, you sense something greater is at stake. Amid rapid cuts and music that rises and falls like a distant warning, we'll uncover clues, symbols, and instructions that, according to witnesses and traditions, were left for those who pay attention, and paying attention today can be the difference between complacency and spiritual protection. Have you ever felt that shiver in your chest when you hear a story and realize it could have been written for you? Stay with me until the end of this video, because what you discover now may surprise you and perhaps reorder priorities you didn't even know you needed to adjust. We're not here to sensationalize or create panic. We're here to listen clearly, compare signs, and understand what these messages demand. Conversion of heart, vigilance, prayer practices, preparation for spiritual trials, and above all, call to protect family and community. Throughout this introduction, I'll interweave accounts and keywords that hark back to the very origins of Medjugorje, such as messages, private letter from the Virgin, spiritual protection, preparation for tribulation, and signs of the times, but always in a natural way, without forcing interpretations. Imagine intercutting scenes, an old closed diary, a hand tearing open an old envelope, cuts to mountains and hills where people kneel, and a low voice over whispering what many fear to admit, that there are warnings that weren't meant for everyone, and that now, suddenly, the urgency grows. Perhaps you'll ask me if all this is real. Perhaps you've heard bits and pieces, fragments, rumors about a private letter or instructions that haven't reached the general public. The goal here is not to proclaim immutable certainties, but to present evidence, test signs, and cautiously offer practical paths to discernment. Throughout the video, I will highlight voices that cry out for attention, signs that insist on appearing, and practices of prayer and protection for families seeking to anchor themselves in times of uncertainty. And if the word tribulation sounds too heavy, think of it simply as a test, a trial that can be personal, communal, or global, and which, according to these accounts, demands concrete responses, constant prayer, fasting, reconciliation, and a renewed outlook on spiritual life. As the soundtrack sets the pace and the cuts accelerate to keep your heart attentive, I will guide you through each of the 7 messages, not to create fear, but to offer clarity and prepare the ground for life-saving choices. Perhaps you are watching out of curiosity, perhaps out of faith, perhaps out of fear. Whatever the reason, ask yourself now, am I willing to listen to the end and put into practice what is necessary? This introduction is the trigger, the hook that opens the door to the details that follow, where each message will be revealed with context, testimonies, and practical guidance. Hold on tight, because the next part will begin to unravel the first of the 7 secrets and show exactly why the clock seems to have started ticking against us. If this topic resonates with you in any way, please do me and this community a favor. Leave a comment below with what touched you most in experience, a question, even a sign you've noticed in your life. Reading your stories helps me understand what truly matters to the viewer. And when you share, others seeking spiritual guidance and protection may find this video just when they need it most. If this content resonates, please give it a like. A simple gesture, but it signals to the algorithm that we need to be heard and allows more families to reach these unrevealed messages of Medjugorje. And if you want to continue receiving videos like this, with in-depth analysis, testimonies, and practical steps for preparation and prayer, subscribe to the channel. This is the place where we will journey together, learn to discern the signs of the times, and seek spiritual protection for our homes. Your participation isn't just empty advertising, it's what keeps this project alive, allows me to research further, bring in sources, interview witnesses, and produce quality content that saves and transforms. So comment, like, and subscribe before we move on. Take a deep breath, because now we're going to begin to unravel the first of the 7 messages, and what it asks may change the way you view your prayer and protection routine. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Medjugorje is above all a place where faith has found a voice that insists on being heard. Nestled between mountains and hills, this region has become a meeting point for those seeking signs, prayer, and a renewed meaning for life. The messages that emerge from there are conveyed by simple people, witnesses who recount experiences of encounters with what they describe as the Virgin Mary, accounts that over the decades have attracted attention, disbelief, devotion, and even controversy. It's important to understand, we're not talking about rumors. There are testimonies that disturb the powerful. Some words have been kept secret, for various reasons involving discernment, protection, spiritual strategy, and, in some cases, the care not to create panic in vulnerable communities. Stories of a private letter or confidential instructions are filtered through eyewitness accounts, religious leaders, and even verification processes that attempt to separate what is true from what is humanly fabricated. But why have some of these messages remained hidden? In some traditions, gradual revelation protects a person's spiritual autonomy. Giving everything at once can paralyze rather than mobilize. In other situations, secrecy was a response to institutional and political pressures. Words that touch on power structures often provoke resistance. Therefore, understanding Medjugorje requires a perspective that goes beyond folklore. It requires investigation, careful documentation, fact-checking, and, above all, empathy with those who live these experiences. There are accounts that describe signs in the sky, intimate conversations, repeated invitations to prayer and fasting, and practical guidance for cultivating spiritual protection in daily life. These instructions, when transmitted in secret, take on a weight of intimacy. They are messages intended for those willing to listen with their hearts and transform their mindset. Transformation is not just a pretty word. It is a process that affects decisions, priorities, and habits. It is the change of a mind that until then had a different history. When we speak of impact and journey, we also speak of the behind-the-scenes aspects of this experience. Nighttime encounters, life-changing witnesses, families who claim to have found peace thanks to simple practices recommended in the undisclosed messages. Some of these accounts point to instructions that directly impact family care, the creation of a domestic prayer environment, and decision-making guided by faith and discernment. It is not uncommon for these guidelines to clash with a modern mindset that values immediate and visible solutions. The hidden truth, therefore, demands patience, silence, and a type of active listening that many have abandoned in the rush of everyday life. That's why it's so important to look honestly at what these testimonies affirm, not as imposed doctrines, but as invitations to reflection, small practices that, together, generate a real impact on people's lives. There's also a collective component to this story. When communities come together, practices are amplified, and the result can be a transformation that goes beyond the individual and reaches entire regions. But the question that follows, and which guides us forward, is how these 7 messages, especially the ones we've retained, translate into concrete steps for those who wish to protect their families and live with greater spiritual coherence. Let's carefully examine the nuances, who conveyed each instruction, in what context they emerged, what evidence supports them, and how we can discern their practical application without falling into sensationalism. On this journey of investigation and discovery, we will seek references, contemporary accounts, and signs that resonate with the experience of those who watch, because the goal is to offer tools for discernment, not dogma. If you felt anything while listening to this excerpt, write in the comments. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Imagine an old-fashioned wall clock, one of those with gently creaking hands, but instead of numbers, each mark represents a message, sacred hours. 7 instructions that act as triggers for transformation and concrete decisions. This metaphor of the lady's clock is not just poetic, it helps us visualize time as an active invitation, where each hour demands an attitude, a change of mindset, a small practice that, combined with the others, generates a real impact on the listener's journey. Opening this image, we realize that we are not faced with abstract ideas, but with practical steps, not mere words, but with guidance that, according to reports, emerged in very specific contexts, intimate backgrounds, late-night encounters, life-changing conversations. Each hour on the clock carries with it a symbolic meaning and a tangible application. The first hour can sound like a call to vigilance, strengthening one's prayer life, establishing simple routines of daily communion, deciding to prioritize silence and listening. The second hour, in some accounts, points to reconciliation, difficult decisions, requests for forgiveness, and changes that affect pride and identity, but transform families. When we speak of hidden truth, we are not speaking of impenetrable mystery. We are speaking of truths that require courage to be lived in daily life. The third hour often involves practices of fasting and inner discipline, an adjustment of mindset that resists haste and immediacy, and that prepares the heart for challenges that may seem spiritually intense. The testimonies we've received describe these hours as stages in a coherent process. They begin with mental correction, move on to the consolidation of spiritual habits, and culminate in acts of community protection. Some report that a specific hour brought guidance on how to organize the home as a space for prayer, a simple act, yet with great impact, while another hour emphasized practices of charity and service, demonstrating that spiritual protection is not merely defensive, but also proactive. In terms of transformation, this means reshaping priorities, less consumption of distractions, more presence, decisions aligned with a larger vision. We cannot ignore the social aspect of these messages. When communities embrace the instructions and implement small changes, we see a multiplier effect. The individual journey becomes a movement that alters routines, educates children, and creates support networks. This is the dimension of the impact that often goes unnoticed. subtle but persistent changes that appear behind the scenes of everyday life, in the way a family prays around the table, in the silence that forms before bed, in the choices made. In the face of crises, revelations of this kind are not spectacles. They are invitations to responsibility and coherence. At the same time, it is essential to maintain an attitude of discernment and intellectual humility. We are not selling ready-made formulas or asserting absolute certainties. What we propose here is careful reading, identifying patterns, comparing accounts, and evaluating whether the suggested instructions harmonize with solid principles of faith, ethics, and common sense. Hasty decisions have never been recommended by those who study these traditions. On the contrary, the best testimonies emphasize verification and gradual practice. Now that we've conceived of the 7 hours as a roadmap of possible actions: reconciliation, discipline, family protection, service, community discernment, and deep prayer, the question that resonates is, how does each hour manifest itself in concrete practice? What are the signs that accompany each instruction? And how can we, in an earthly, everyday way, respond to them without falling into exaggeration? Comment: that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. But first, Hour of Our Lady's clock is a clear and urgent call to personal prayer, a summons that insists on reviving the forgotten habit of daily conversation with what many call sacred. This isn't about empty rituals or religious performance. It's about reclaiming an intimate space where the mind is stilled, the mindset is reorganized, and important decisions find firmer ground. Imagine the scene: a person kneeling in the early hours of the morning, the house silent, only the sound of their own breathing and a dim lamp illuminating a rosary in their hands. Outside, the city lights flicker like reminders of the rush that dominates the day. But there, in that small space, a slow and profound transformation takes place, a reordering of priorities that, over time, changes behavior, choices, and the very journey of faith. This urgency to reclaim daily prayer appears in the messages as an invitation to inner discipline. In times of constant distraction, the practice of setting aside a moment of silence every day works like a muscle that needs to be exercised. The more you practice, the more your mind adjusts to attention, and the less vulnerable it becomes to rushing and impulsive decisions. It's not magic. It's an almost anthropological process that shapes habits, clarifies intentions, and builds a foundation for future challenges. The hidden truth here is simple: small, consistent practices have a cumulative impact. The protection that many witnesses report does not arise from a single fervent prayer, but from years of daily commitment that have transformed mindsets and realigned priorities. To make this concrete, imagine a plausible account. Anna, a mother who worked double shifts for years, says she started setting aside 15 minutes before dawn. At first, it was just an uncomfortable silence. Then it became a discipline. Months later, she reports, she noticed that arguments at home had decreased, that decisions about financial matters began to be made with less fear and more clarity, and that, in moments of crisis, she found an unexpected peace. This imagined account summarizes what many describe as the practical effect of the unrevealed messages. It's not just spiritual advice. It's a transformative methodology that works behind the scenes of everyday life. When discussing personal prayer, it's also important to address discernment: what to ask for, how to establish a routine, and how to distinguish authentic listening from projected insecurities. When messages mention prayer, they often link it to practical actions: reconciliation when necessary, fasting when appropriate, and a renewed appreciation for the family as a space for protection and spiritual nurturing. Decisions that were once reactive become considered. Problems that once haunted the night lose their power in the face of a routine that strengthens the mind and heart. This is the impact the first hour promises: a foundation upon which the remaining hours can in fact operate effectively. Nor should we minimize the communal dimension of this invitation. Personal prayer has double the power when integrated into a network of people who share similar goals, families who pray together, neighborhoods that organize into small circles of support, communities that encourage practices of silence and listening. The revelations surrounding Medjugorje emphasize that spiritual protection is not isolationist. It is lived in responsible interdependence, in the building of habits that reverberate beyond the individual. Finally, considering prayer as a practical aspect of life means understanding its role in shaping a resilient mindset. When implemented consistently, this daily practice provides a framework for decisions, reduces mental noise, and opens space for the hidden truth that often only reveals itself when one is willing to listen slowly. Now, with this notion of the first hour clear before us, the question that follows is, how can we translate this call into practical, accessible exercises for those who live hectic lives, without turning faith into yet another impossible task? Comment below. I'm on this journey too. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject. The second hour of Our Lady's clock takes us directly to the home, not as a mere address, but as a spiritual refuge where daily decisions and practices have a real impact on protecting the family. When the messages speak of home as a sanctuary, it's not just a pretty image, it's an invitation to transform routine, a shift in mindset that places domestic life at the center of the spiritual journey. Instead of seeking spectacular signs, the instruction insists on simple, almost discreet things that accumulate in effect over time. Imagine a home where, in the morning, someone murmurs a blessing upon leaving, where at night there's a small moment of presence before the children go to sleep, where a corner with a sacred object reminds us that there's something greater guiding our decisions. These gestures, repeated, create a field of peace that changes behaviors, reduces fears, and guides difficult choices with greater clarity. The practices suggested in the traditions associated with Medjugorje, when adapted with common sense, are practices of care, praying together before meals, blessing the home with holy water when possible, reserving 5 minutes of silence at the end of the day to listen to the heart of each family member, praying for protection before traveling. These are not superstitious rituals, but rather building habits that shape the collective personality of the home. In practice, this might mean deciding to reduce consumption of anxiety-provoking content, establishing healthy limits on screen time during meals, or choosing to talk before reacting in arguments, small decisions that, together, reinstate a culture of presence and responsibility. To elicit empathy, consider this concrete example. In a simple home, during a stormy night, the youngest child wakes up frightened by thunder and nightmares. Instead of turning on the TV to distract her, the mother lights a candle in the hallway, calls the family together, and says a short, firm prayer, to dispel fear with empty words, but to offer presence. The father, who until then had been working long hours and felt devoid of purpose, holds his daughter's hand and, in that simple gesture, finds meaning again. In the following days, the family begins to set aside a moment of protection before bed. The child improves, arguments decrease, and decisions about routine are made with more serenity. This kind of revelation that the behind-the-scenes nature of domestic care can transform a family's emotional climate is exactly what the messages seem to want to teach us. There are also practical elements that are easy to implement. Creating a prayer space with a symbolic object, arranging a short hour of silence daily, introducing a brief reading of an inspirational text before meals, or practicing a simple blessing at the entrances of the house. The intention is not to overload the routine, but to insert small anchor points that shift everyone's mindset. When daily decisions are informed by these points, the impact manifests in less conflict, more resilience in the face of crises, and a growing sense of purpose. Protection, in this sense, is less an external barrier and more an internal architecture habits that make the family less susceptible to panic, haste, and impulsive choices. It's also important to realize that protecting your family requires the courage to adjust priorities, perhaps paying less for entertainment and investing more in presence, perhaps choosing difficult conversations to reconcile wounded relationships, perhaps prioritizing rest and prayer over exhausting workdays. Transformation and discipline go hand in hand here. It's not about perfection, but about consistency. And when neighbors and communities begin to adopt similar practices, protection expands, transforming personal habits into support networks. This second hour, therefore, is not a rigid manual, but a flexible script of small actions that, aligned with the hidden truth of the messages, produce a real effect in practical life. It is the kindness of repeated decisions that builds a refuge capable of withstanding fears and storms. With this image of home as a sanctuary in mind, the question that arises is, what crucial gestures, accessible to any routine, should we incorporate first so that this protection begins to truly operate? Comment: that makes sense to me. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject. The third hour of the Lady's Clock is a direct and urgent invitation to a conversion of heart, not a spectacular conversion, but an intimate and persistent change that begins with humility, passes through reparation, and is consolidated in reconciliation. Conversion here means reframing one's mindset, abandoning justifications that protect the ego, letting go of hurtful attitudes, and accepting the discipline of repairing what has been broken. It's a hidden truth that often disturbs. Profound transformation almost never comes without pain and concrete decisions. The story of conversion is not just a mystical tale. It is a sequence of small renunciations, choices, and practices that gradually reshape personal and community life. Think of humility, not as self-abandonment, but as the courage to look within, acknowledge mistakes, and choose reparation over defense. This choice makes an impact. Families that previously lived in tension find spaces for dialogue, frayed communities reconnect, and people who seemed irreversibly distant rediscover meaning and purpose. Imagine, for a moment, a simple and human story. Marcos was a proud man, accustomed to reacting with irony and silence when he felt hurt. Over the years, this behavior created a rift with his teenage daughter, who began to seek refuge in friendships and social media. During a night of personal prayer, the fruit of the first hour you already know he received, with regret, the realization that he needed to make amends. It wasn't a dramatic sermon, it was a practical and humble decision. He put his cell phone aside for a week, wrote a heartfelt letter, and sought out someone he trusted to mediate a meeting. The initial contact was awkward, full of tears and truncated explanations, but there was also a moment of silence that paved the way for reconciliation. His daughter, touched by the change in attitude more than by the words, accepted the gesture. Months later, the relationship gained a new rhythm. Family decisions became more collaborative, and a caring mindset replaced the old defensive dynamic. This mini-story exemplifies the journey of reparation: small actions, repeated consistently, that produce real, human transformation. Conversion of the heart requires concrete practices of reparation. Publicly acknowledging mistakes when appropriate, seeking reconciliation with those who have been hurt, making restitution for what has been taken, and, above all, committing to tangible changes in behavior. It's not about spectacle. It's about coherence between words and actions. This coherence is what gives credibility to revelations and the decisions that arise from them. When someone decides to take notice, the results are visible behind the scenes in everyday life: less resentment in conversations, decisions more aligned with the common good, and a mindset focused on service rather than personal gain. It's also important to talk about boundaries. Making amends doesn't mean allowing continued abuse or erasing one's own dignity. Healthy conversion is characterized by recognizing limits, establishing new rules of coexistence, and protecting the vulnerable, while simultaneously promoting restoration. The journey requires a balance between courage and prudence, between humility and wisdom. In practical terms, many of the unrevealed messages that reach us point to simple paths: mediated reconciliation meetings, practices of confession and sincere repentance, and restorative gestures that show more than words. They show life change. The inner transformation that arises from this work not only alters personal relationships, but also resonates throughout the community. When individuals reconcile, the social fabric is strengthened, and the collective capacity to face trials grows. This is the impact the third hour promises: a less fragmented community, more responsible decisions, and a shared journey more guided by principles of truth and justice. If you feel this call resonates with you, knowing how to listen and act courageously is a crucial part of the journey. Comment: I'm on this journey too. With a more open heart, the narrative continues to unfold how these attitudes translate into concrete practices over the hours that follow. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. When messages speak of signs accompanying warnings, they aren't limited to poetic imagery. They speak of manifestations that permeate the visible world: changes in nature, disturbances that surprise entire communities, and a kind of moral confusion that seems to displace values and references. It's not immediately clear what is supernatural and what is simply the result of historical cycles, social crises, or media manipulation. Therefore, the first golden rule is to keep a cool head and an attentive heart. Research: don't be led by fear. This phrase should be engraved as a practical mantra: research plus faith plus serenity, because hidden truth only reveals its value when evaluated calmly, contextually, and responsibly. Signs in nature can manifest as unusual changes in animal behavior, atypical weather phenomena, or celestial events that capture the attention of observers. Disturbances can include outbreaks of collective anxiety, spikes in unexpected violence, or a pervasive sense that moral norms have lost their bearings. Moral confusion, in turn, arises when truths that once seemed solid become rapidly and decisions that were once obvious become controversial. These elements, when present together, create a pattern that attracts attention, but the pattern is only meaningful when rigorously verified, away from the spectacle. So how do we discern the spiritual from the media? Start with the source. Prioritize reports that provide documents, dates, and names. Choose independent testimonies that converge on similar details. Seek original records rather than sensationalist Consider the context. A phenomenon captured by a single viral camera doesn't carry the same weight as something recorded by multiple witnesses in different places and with temporal coherence. Also examine the fruits. Spiritual authenticity often produces peace, conversion, charity, and coherence. The media spectacle often generates fear, confusion, polarization, and financial benefits for those who exploit the subject. This analysis of fruits is a practical tool for discernment. If the reaction is panic and profit, be suspicious. If it's an invitation to transformation and moral decision, take it more seriously. Another useful tool is the test of time. Genuine events tend to resist verification and reveal new layers when investigated. Rumors and fakes tend to crumble when confronted with concrete data. Use technology to your advantage. Check metadata, timestamps, and sources of publications. Compare versions. Check translations and direct statements from witnesses. Also, don't underestimate the value of consulting reliable authorities, reputable spiritual leaders, researchers, or entities with a track record of verification. But always maintain autonomy. Authority is a guide, not a replacement for your own judgment. On a practical, everyday level, adopt a mindset to prevent information hysteria. Filter sources, determine windows for news consumption, and set aside specific times to reflect and pray about what you've heard. A simple practice of spiritual journaling can help. Write down what you've seen. Compare it with other sources after 24 to 48 hours. And ask yourself, does this promote transformation or just noise? Another strategy is to look for internal signals: peace, clarity, confidence in decisions as indicators that an interpretation is aligned with the truth worth following. This exercise connects discernment and concrete practices, transforming passive reading into an active journey of responsibility. There's an additional caveat. Often, agents with political or economic interests disguise narratives as spiritual messages. The habit of checking who profits from a headline is also an exercise in discernment. Recovering the capacity for civilized investigation is, paradoxically, a spiritual act. It requires intellectual humility, the courage to question, and the discipline to work with evidence. Behind the scenes, serious investigators often find connections that go unnoticed by the hasty viewer. Hence, the importance of not accepting summaries or headlines as the final word. With this lens, signs cease to be cause for panic and become clues that require thoughtful decisions, adjusting routines, protecting families, strengthening local networks, and acting ethically. From here, the question remains, what material evidence accompanies each type of sign, and how can we translate it into concrete actions without overdoing it? Comment, that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. The 6th hour of the Lady's Clock touches on a point that often troubles modernity: the call to fasting and vigil. These are not empty rites or endurance tests. They are disciplines that awaken the soul, sharpen spiritual judgment, and reorient the mindset when faced with crucial decisions. When the message speaks of fasting, it points to a practice that removes from the body and routine what anesthetizes a successive internet, unbridled consumption, food that dulls sensitivity so that the spirit regains clarity. Vigil, in turn, is the act of remaining awake in prayer or contemplation, a time when inner defenses are strengthened, hidden truth has space to emerge, and revelations find fertile ground. Ultimately, both practices work together. Fasting reduces the noise of the senses, vigilance educates attention. Together, they produce a real impact on the capacity for discernment. It's not unattainable, mysticism, it's transformation through intelligently applied discipline. Think of vigilance as an intimate laboratory, where you test convictions and adjust decisions. Think of fasting as a fast from distractions that clears mental filters and stirs consciousness. The journey doesn't require heroism, it requires constancy. Small, repeated gestures tend to generate lasting changes in behavior, priorities, and relationships. To make this practical and adaptable, I propose alternatives that respect modern routines and personal limitations. If your life is busy, start with partial fasting. Choose one meal a day to simplify, perhaps dinner, and use this saved time for 15 minutes of silence or spiritual reading. If possible, extend the fast for 12 hours overnight, for example. Having an early dinner and skipping the late-night snack, always considering your health and, if you have medical conditions, consulting a professional. For those who have never fasted, one light fasting day per week, entering the week with a clear intention can be transformative. As for the vigil, adapt it to your situation. It doesn't have to be an entire night. A short vigil can be an hour of deep presence before bed, an occasional late-night prayer dedicated to specific intentions, or even a weekly 30-minute family vigil where everyone shares concerns and prays together. For those who work shifts or have small children, a symbolic vigil works, getting up 15 minutes early to pray in silence or doing an hour of reflective reading while the rest of the household sleeps. The important thing is the quality of the time, not just the quantity. These practices also serve as training for spiritual judgment. When the soul is more awake, decisions are made less on impulse and more on clarity. People who adopt fasting and vigilance report fewer immediate emotional reactions, greater patience, and a more refined intuition for discerning motives and consequences. That is, the ability to choose wisely when faced with family, professional, or moral dilemmas. There is a cumulative effect. Fasting shapes the body, vigilance educates the spirit, and together, these habits change the way we live. We can't forget the community aspect. Collective vigils strengthen bonds and multiply impact. When neighborhoods or small communities come together for vigil, the result is often greater resilience in the face of crises and a practical support network. Behind the scenes, these actions build trust for difficult decisions and foster a culture of presence that translates into concrete protection for families. And a word of caution: practice responsibly. Those with health problems, diabetes, pregnancy, or other conditions should adjust fasting and vigils with professional guidance. Discernment is also this, knowing your own limits while striving for transformation. By incorporating these disciplines gradually and consciously, you open space for practices that not only promise, but deliver a calmer mind, more aligned decisions, and a renewed sense of purpose. Now that we understand how fasting and vigil can function as practical tools for spiritual and mental strengthening, imagine what this does to the remaining hours of the Lady's Watch, when the instructions go from idea to routine. Comment: I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. The 7th hour of the Lady's Clock arrives as a silent climax. It is not an apocalyptic cry, but an insistent invitation to active preparation, a spiritual armor made of community, sacraments, and works of mercy. Imagine the cinematic scene. The antique clock advances its hands with a heavy creak. The camera zooms in on the dial as clouds move across the sky. All around, ordinary people make simple, decisive choices and gather in prayer. Others calmly close doors, and still others share what little they have. It is the moment when the difference between panic and calm preparation is revealed in every gesture. The choice is not between fear and indifference, but between reacting impulsively and structuring a life that withstands crises with lucidity, compassion, and steadfastness. The spiritual armor of this time has concrete pieces. First, the community, neighborhoods that organize themselves into circles of practical support, groups that gather to exchange reliable information, families that combine routines of prayer and mutual support. This isn't communal romanticism. It's a human strategy. Local networks reduce the impact of shocks, offer emotional support, and enable wiser collective decisions. Second, the sacraments, confession that heals broken consciences, the Eucharist that nurtures serene courage, the presence of rites that anchor and orient the mind in the face of chaos. For those who believe, these elements are not magical. They are sources of moral strength and clarity of judgment, capable of transforming a reactive mindset into a responsible and resilient one. The works of mercy complete the armor. Active preparation includes caring for the vulnerable, feeding the hungry, welcoming the lonely, visiting the sick, actions that simultaneously protect and educate. When a community practices organized charity, it creates practical response mechanisms. Community kitchens, exchanges of essential goods, information networks on real needs. These initiatives are revelations of a type of humble leadership that seeks not the spotlight, but only results. The hidden truth is that real protection arises much more from the act of giving than from any alarmist rhetoric. But how does this translate into daily decisions? Transformation requires steps, not just intentions. Start by identifying points of vulnerability at home and in the neighborhood. Which elderly people need support? Which families have young children who has specific knowledge that could be helpful? Health, electrical, logistics. Organize practical lists and establish routines, and alternating visitation plan. A cooperative travel schedule, a safe meeting point. Integrate sacraments into practical life. Community confession calendars, groups that accompany each other to Mass when possible. Weekly moments of spiritual reading that nourish the collective mindset. In parallel, implement regular works of mercy, preparing shared meals once a week, exchanging skills among neighbors, creating small emergency aid boxes. These are acts that transform fear into service, and service into moral resilience. Armor also requires training in judgment, discernment exercises to avoid rash decisions, crisis response simulations to train calm, and habit cultivation that reinforces rational decisions. Adequate sleep, prayer schedules, eating and financial routines that reduce anxiety. Behind the scenes, it's these small practices that build resilience. A community that wakes up, organizes, and decides together is more likely to weather storms than isolated individuals. True revelations usually require coherence, not spectacle. Therefore, preparation is a series of repeated acts that form a culture of protection. There is also an ethical component. Protecting does not mean closing doors to others, but rather becoming capable of effectively reaching out. The armor the 7th hour demands is not egoic shielding. It is a fortress of compassion. When priorities are reorganized, less consumption, more presence, less spectacle, more servicey, impact spreads. Decisions that were once impulsive gain clarity, and the collective journey deepens in meaning. The hidden truth of these hours is that, as the clock ticks, each daily choice shapes the profile of a community's resilience. As the clock ticks toward the last hour, the screen shows faces in concrete actions. Someone bringing food to a neighbor, another family gathered in simple prayer, a group preparing aid bags. It's in this image that we perceive the difference between panic and calm preparation, not due to the absence of fear, but due to the presence of decisions that transform fear into action. With this scene in mind, the narrative continues to reveal how to organize these practices step by step, so that the armor doesn't remain just an idea, but becomes a living part of the routine. Comment: that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. It's natural for difficult questions and objections to arise when we talk about messages that have been withheld. Why weren't they revealed sooner? And won't this be an unnecessary alarm? These questions deserve an honest and calm answer, because the credibility of any investigation depends on transparency and respect for doubts. First, we need to understand that silence, in many cases, is not malicious concealment, it's prudence. There are institutional backrooms, verification processes, and pastoral considerations that guide when and how certain words should be made public. Hasty revelations can generate panic, media manipulation, and interpretations that distort the original intention. Therefore, some instructions are kept hidden until there are elements of context, sufficient testimonies, and signs that the community can receive them without being disoriented. This stance isn't cowardice. It's a decision that weighs the consequences and prioritizes the protection of the vulnerable, a decision that is also part of the very ethics of those who transmit or evaluate a spiritual experience. Another reason has to do with the time it takes for truth to mature. Many hidden truths only become clear over the course of a journey, when patterns are confirmed, when accounts converge, and when practical consequences become visible. The transformation these messages demand doesn't work like a light switch. It's a process that alters mindsets, decisions, and habits. Disclosing everything immediately could generate superficial curiosity without real commitment, while a gradual revelation encourages practice, discipline, and maturity. Furthermore, there is a concrete risk of any alarmist narrative being exploited politically or commercially. Therefore, institutional prudence also protects against instrumentalizations that would shift the focus away from the proposed practices: prayer, fasting, reconciliation, and service, and relegate it to the realm of spectacle and polarization. As for the objection that it's alarm, it's important to distinguish between responsible alert and panic. A responsible alert aims for calm preparation, reorganizing priorities, and building resilience. An alarm seeks virality and profit. The messages we're addressing emphasize practices that improve daily life, family protection, community solidarity, moral coherence. If you examine the results, you'll see that sincere initiatives generate less panic and more sensible decisions. That's why we insist: do your research. Don't be led by fear. Investigate sources, compare testimonies, observe real results in the lives of people who have adopted these practices. This is what transforms suspicion into understanding. There is also the psychological and pastoral dimension. Many revelations are communicated with the intention of calling for conversion, not predicting sensational catastrophes. Words, when well managed, serve as an invitation to change habits, reflect on priorities, and care for children. When poorly managed, they become a mechanism for collective anxiety. Recognizing this risk is an act of intellectual honesty. Therefore, when approaching reports and documents, adopt an experimental and empirical approach. Test small suggested practices. Observe the impact on your routine, your family environment, and your ability to make calmer decisions. This approach combines investigation and expeditious research and practice, and is the most concrete way to assess whether a message is well-founded and useful. Finally, I clearly answer the implicit question: if the messages exist and were withheld out of prudence, this does not make them less relevant. On the contrary, it may indicate concern for the right timing and people's ability to assimilate them without harm. Hidden truth, when revealed responsibly, should produce fruits of peace, charity, and coherence. I invite you, therefore, to investigate carefully, to consult reliable sources, to dialogue with those who study these phenomena, and, above all, to try the minimal practices: proposed prayer, presence in the home, small works of mercy, to see the real impact on your life. It is at this intersection between investigation and practice that doubt transforms into discernment, and discernment into decisions that shape a new mindset. With this attitude, we move forward, ready to delve deeper into the evidence and practical applications hidden in the coming hours of Our Lady's clock. Comment: this makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic. Transforming intention into practice requires a clear and accessible plan, something that changes your mindset without overwhelming your routine. The proposal I bring here is simple, concrete, and designed for you to start today. 7 steps that, together, translate the emotion of revelations into daily decisions with real impact. First step: establish a short daily prayer. A 3 to 5 minute moment, right after waking up. It doesn't need to be elaborate. An invocation for your family, a request for clarity and decisions, and a moment of silence to listen. This small habit acts as an anchor for the journey and organizes the day from an inner center. Second step: do a 2-minute examination of conscience at the end of the day. Ask yourself what you did well, where you went wrong, And what simple adjustments can resolve this tomorrow? This exercise shapes the hidden truth of the heart, creating a cycle of repair and transformation that prevents the accumulation of resentment. Third step. Implement 3 immediate actions to protect your family, both symbolic and practical. This could be blessing your home with water or words, scheduling a quick text check-in with relatives who live alone, and setting aside screen-free time at night. These 3 measures, repeated, build a daily refuge and change the emotional architecture of your home. Fourth step. Adopt a weekly practice of fasting or silence tailored to your health's simplified meal, or an hour less on social media on Sundays, and combine this with a short period of wakefulness, even if it's just 15 minutes of reflective reading. This habit sharpens your spiritual judgment and reduces the noise that impedes wise decisions. Fifth step. Organize an information filter to find windows for news consumption. Verify sources before sharing and keep a notebook of observations about signs and coincidences you notice. This filter is a practical tool for discernment that protects your mind from media clutter and allows you to calmly evaluate the revelations that reach you. Sixth step. Build or strengthen a minimal network of trust. Identify 2 or 3 family members or friends with whom you can exchange practical and spiritual support. Arrange short meetings, resource exchanges, and an emergency communication channel. Collective strength transforms isolated actions into community impact. Behind the scenes, this network will be your most effective armor when difficult decisions arise. Seventh step. Commit to a simple, ongoing work of mercy. Preparing a monthly food basket, visiting a homeless elderly person, or donating time to teach someone a practical skill. Real transformation comes through service. It's through everyday actions that the mindset shifts from consumption to giving, and this change reverberates throughout family and local culture. To prevent this plan from becoming an unfulfilled intention, I suggest incorporating it into micro-routines. Set a 7 a.m. reminder for prayer, a 10 p.m. alarm for examination of conscience. Add the adapted fast to your family calendar, and mark your cell phone for meetings with your network. Measure progress. Simply, a line on the calendar for each day you completed the prayer, a weekly note on how the 3 protective actions affected your home, and a monthly record of the works of mercy performed. These indicators are small mirrors that show how the journey of transformation progresses, and prevent the practice from becoming diluted by good intentions. When it comes to decision-making, adopt a rule of thumb before making an important choice. Breathe, consult your discernment notebook, and, if possible, talk to someone in your network. This short pause reduces impulses and increases coherence between intention and action. Behind the scenes, you'll see that the sum of these steps shifts priorities, reduces anxiety, and creates a tangible impact on your routine. Revelations that once seemed distant begin to touch your real life when we transform revelation into a method. None of this promises a miracle solution. It's a roadmap with likely results, testable and adaptable to your reality. Start small, evaluate the effects, and adjust. The hidden truth these practices reveal isn't a mystical secret, but a discipline that bears fruit: less reactivity, more clarity, wiser decisions, and a community capable of responding generously. With this plan in hand, the question remains: what adaptations you need to make today to truly implement these steps in your life? Comment below. This makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. We close this cycle by closely observing each hour as if the dial of Our Lady's clock were counting down. And it is in this rhythm that I want to recap with you, visually and emotionally, what we have experienced thus far. 7. The active armor community, sacraments, works of mercy that transform panic into service. 6. Fasting and vigil, disciplines that clear the noise and sharpen spiritual judgment. 5. Discernment in the face of signs, learning to distinguish the spiritual from the media with research.com, and responsibility for signs in nature and morality that demand attention, not hysteria. Patterns that, when verified, change decisions. 3. Conversion of heart, humility, reparation, and reconciliation, the intimate transformation that reorders relationships and priorities. 2. Protection of the home, simple practices, a routine of presence, blessings, and concrete decisions that create an environment of safety. 1. The call to personal prayer, the daily muscle that sustains the entire journey. Now visualize each of these hours decreasing in number on the dial, a countdown that is not meant to accelerate panic, but to press wise action. The scene I propose is simultaneously cinematic and intimate. The camera pans across the clock face, zooms in on the sound of its ticking, and cuts to human scenes: a family exchanging a gesture of care, a neighbor's candlelighting vigil, a person writing in a notebook of discernment before bed. There's tension as the clock approaches its final chime, but there's also a light that grows in small decisions. Someone suspending unbridled consumption too fast for a meal, another opening their door to welcome an elderly person, a community organizing a simple plan of mutual aid. This duality, urgency and hope, is the heart of the hidden truth we've been exploring. This isn't a sensationalist apocalypse, but an invitation to transformation that shifts mindsets and everyday decisions. Feel the impact of this image. We don't want to be alarmists. We want to be realistic. The clock is ticking, marking the need for choices. The transformation we seek requires constant microactions, prayer discipline, acts of reparation, information filters, community gatherings which combined form a mindset capable of endurance. Behind the scenes, this is where the secret lies. The daily reinforcement of simple habits generates a greater impact than grandiose plans made in panic. When a family decides to change a routine, when a neighbor decides to reach out, when a group chooses to watch and fast with purpose, the hidden truth ceases to be theory and becomes practical force. At the same time, keep responsibility in mind. Investing time in serious research, checking sources, and evaluating the results is part of the work. The journey requires courage to decide and humility to learn. You may feel fear, it's human, but what transforms fear into productive action is faith combined with wisdom. There is time, yes, as long as the response is active. Resuming prayers, arranging the home as a refuge, initiating fasting and vigil practices, strengthening community ties, and exercising discernment in the face of signs. Hope is not passive. It demands choices aligned with principles that preserve life and dignity. Before we move on to the practical details that make all this routinely executable, I invite you to a simple and valuable gesture. Tell us in the comments which time on the clock needs to change in your life. Prayer, family protection, conversion, discernment, fasting, signs, or active preparation. If you prefer, write just one word that summarizes your commitment. And if you want to continue receiving practical guides on these warnings and how to apply them without panic, there's a related video that delves into concrete exercises for protecting your family. It's worth watching. Next. If you stayed until the end, this is for you. Let's do this together. If you've made it this far, thank you for walking with me these hours. Your presence makes all the difference. If the content brought you something valuable, if it helped clarify a decision or light a flame of care in your home, consider subscribing to the channel. Here I will continue to bring practical guides, stories, and tools for those who want to respond with faith and wisdom, not panic. If this video touched you, leave a short comment saying, "I'm with you until the end." I read each message, and they help us understand what else we need to bring in future topics. Also, give a like if you felt this content brought clarity. It's a simple gesture that allows me to produce more episodes with quality and responsibility. There's a video here that complements this topic with concrete practices to protect your family. Click and stay with me there to see exercises you can start implementing now. Stay with this feeling of active hope. There's still time to transform routine into protection and fear into service. Thank you for being here. We're in this together.